Hello, friends. Our final story is one that used to be broadcast on American airwaves for decades on Christmas Eve, told by none other than the renowned storyteller Paul Harvey. Now, Paul Harvey, he looked at the origins of this story. He found it published in a book, but he could get no farther than that because he wanted to get deeper. Who actually experienced the story? He couldn't find it. Several have tried since. They could not find it. But it all begins with a man. And this is a mostly good man. He is generous to his family. He's upright in his business dealings. As a matter of fact, he has a lot of integrity. But as time went on, he had a lot of difficulty believing in the incarnation. Now, the incarnation is the idea that God would become a man and dwell with us as Jesus did on Christmas. So Christmas Eve service was terribly difficult for him because he just could not get himself to believe it. It made no sense to him. So it came to a point where he felt that his integrity was at stake, and so he didn't want to pretend anymore. So he broke the news to his wife. He said he wasn't going to be going to church with her on Christmas Eve. It would be hypocritical for him to do so because he just could not believe it. He said he would stay home, he would wait up for them because he didn't want them to feel cut off from him or anything like that, but he would wait for them to come back from service. When Christmas Eve came along, the man's wife dutifully packed up the children into the family car, and they drove away to the church. And so the man, he said he would wait up, of course, and so he settled down into his favorite chair and began to read the newspaper. And so he was doing so for a little while when he realized that a storm had come up out of the blue, quickly, very quickly. He could see from outside snow would begin to fall. It was falling prodigiously, as a matter of fact. He looked outside at the temperature gauge, thermometer, and the temperature was dropping. It was dropping quickly. He wasn't fearing for his family, though. The church was not far. The vehicle was in good condition and robust. They'd be able to get through and back without a problem. So he settles back into the chair, and he's reading his newspaper, and he's there for a couple minutes before he begins to hear a thud. And then a couple more thuds. And it sounds like someone is throwing snowballs at his living room window. So he hurries over and he opens the door, trying to figure out what's going on. And what had happened is he opens up the door and he sees a flock of birds not far from his house. They are huddled outside miserably in the snow, and occasionally one is trying to fly into his living room for shelter, for the warmth that is obviously there, and they hit the window, and then they just fall down dazed. This flock of birds had been caught in this storm that had quickly come up, and they were in trouble. Well, again, this is a man of integrity. He thought, well, I don't want these birds just to freeze and die. So he goes back inside and he puts on his galoshes and he puts on his warm coat. And he knows how to solve this problem. He's like, I'll just open up the barn. So he opens up the barn, which isn't far from the house. He takes the sliding doors and opens them up, and he even turns on the light, and the birds should be able to shelter in the barn, and the problem will be solved. But the only problem is that the birds didn't go in. He couldn't get them to come. They just were freezing miserably in the snow. They didn't see the solution. So he changed tactics. He went back inside and he got some breadcrumbs, the kind, you use for cooking, usually on top of a dish or a casserole. And he got close to them as close as they could without startling them, and he made a breadcrumb trail all the way to the barn. Assuredly, they'll just see the breadcrumbs, they'll eat like birds are supposed to eat breadcrumbs, and find shelter in the barn. But the birds ignored the breadcrumbs. They just continued to flap helplessly in the snow and occasionally dash themselves against this window. They wouldn't come in. So finally he thought, maybe I should just try to catch them. So he would try to catch them, but they would scatter in every direction as soon as he came close, every direction except for the barn, of course. And so he stopped. He thought about it. He said, what do we need to do? And he realized the birds were just afraid of him. As they struggled in the snow, he couldn't figure a way around their fear of him. They were adverse to him. They probably had a dread and an aversion to him. Imagine just his size alone compared to theirs. They weren't going to follow him. They weren't going to do what he wanted because they didn't understand that his intentions were nice. He was simply trying to keep them from freezing to death in the snow, but they didn't know that. So he threw up his hands in frustration. This is useless. This is hopeless. The only way he would ever be able to get them to understand that they need to fly to the barn was if he was a bird himself. Then perhaps he could fly into the barn or communicate to them, and they would find safety and not freeze to death in the snow. And at that moment, service ended, and the bells began to ring on the church, and he could hear them, just like at the end of every Christmas Eve service. And in a flash, in a moment, looking at the birds in their distress, flapping around, freezing in the snow, he understood all of a sudden why God decided to become a man. All of a sudden, the incarnation made perfect sense. Grace and peace to you, my friends. And don't forget the important things as we celebrate the day that God became a man. Take care.